Ethan Reed had everything. The sprawling penthouse in the heart of the city, the luxury cars lined up outside his door, and a bank account that seemed to grow faster than he could spend it. At 35, Ethan was the epitome of success. People envied him, admired him, and even feared him. But, behind the polished facade, there was a man who had long abandoned any ties to his past. Ethan's story wasn't one of privilege. It was one of relentless drive. Born into a modest family, he had risen from nothing. No handouts, no shortcuts. Every decision, every sacrifice had led him to this point. And yet, when he looked in the mirror, the man staring back felt like a stranger. The wealth he'd built had come at a cost that left him isolated and disconnected from everything that once mattered. It had been 23 years since his father, Thomas Reed, passed away. A man who had been as rigid as the empire he built, Thomas had been a figure Ethan struggled to understand. Their relationship had always been cold, defined more by silent dinners and unspoken expectations than genuine affection. For as long as he could remember, Ethan had tried, and failed, to meet the towering image his father had set for him. Now, with his father gone, Ethan had avoided his grave for all these years, finding no reason to return to the man who had never really been there for him. It wasn't that he didn't miss him. Ethan didn't know what it was. There was just a void, one that neither time nor wealth could fill. Every memory of his father felt like a distant echo, faded and unresolved. But what if the past was about to catch up with him in a way he couldn't ignore? If you're curious about what happens next, and how a single moment could change everything for Ethan, stick around. Make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, so you don't miss out on the twists ahead. In the fast-paced world Ethan inhabited, no one had the luxury of slowing down. Every day was a race, meetings, decisions, deals, and more deals. His private life was a maze of missed calls from relatives he barely spoke to and forgotten birthdays. The man who had built his empire was a man who had left his personal connections to decay. His wealth was his world now, and everything else seemed secondary. Yet, deep down, Ethan knew something was missing. He couldn't quite place it. An unsettling emptiness, a feeling that kept him awake at night as he stared out the window of his sleek office building, looking at the city that had become his cage. As the days bled into one another, Ethan's father's memory lingered like an uninvited guest. The unresolved issues, the lack of closure, hovered in his mind, gnawing at him whenever he dared to confront them. He thought about how different things could have been if his father had ever tried harder to connect, to understand him. But those thoughts were fleeting. Ethan had learned to lock them away. The one thing Ethan couldn't escape, however, was the call from his past. A past he had buried so deep that it had nearly forgotten him. Stay tuned to see how one simple encounter begins to unravel everything Ethan has spent years running from. It was one of those dreary afternoons when the sky seemed to hang low, heavy with rain that soaked the world below. The streets were slick, reflections of neon lights blurring in the puddles, and the usual bustle of the city was subdued by the greyness. Ethan Reed had been walking to his car after another exhausting day of meetings when the rain began to fall harder, forcing him to duck under the awning of a nearby church. He hated these moments of pause, these pauses where his mind could wander and bring up thoughts he preferred to ignore. But for now, there was nothing to do but wait for the rain to ease. It was then that his eyes landed on her. An elderly woman sat against the stone walls of the church, her frail body hunched beneath a tattered coat. A small cardboard sign rested in her lap, scribbled in shaky handwriting. "Anything helps." She looked almost like a shadow herself, blending into the wet pavement. Her face, though weathered by age and hardship, seemed oddly familiar to him, like an image he might have seen once in the background of his life, a distant, forgotten memory. Ethan tried to look away, the way he always did, when faced with situations like this. His life was a whirlwind of meetings and targets. He had no time for distractions. But something about this woman stopped him. She was positioned so that the edge of the umbrella he was holding almost brushed against her. He took another step back, intent on walking away, but her eyes locked onto his, a sudden sharp awareness in them. Her gaze was steady, not pleading, not desperate, but something deeper, something he couldn't quite place. She seemed to see right through him. Ethan had walked by countless beggars before. Most of them were just faces in the crowd, all asking for something, offering nothing in return. He had learned long ago to tune out their pleas, a defense mechanism he'd honed over years of wealth and distance. But this woman was different. There was no desperation in her eyes, only quiet resignation. And yet, there was something more. Something in the way she looked at him made him feel, for the briefest moment, like he wasn't alone in the city. Without fully understanding why, Ethan found himself stepping closer. He hesitated for only a second before reaching into his wallet and pulling out a thick wad of bills. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He dropped $450 into her hands without a word, his mind already racing ahead to his next appointment. As the money touched her fingers, she looked up at him, her face momentarily illuminated by the faint glow of a nearby street lamp. The words that left her lips were so soft, they seemed to hang in the air between them, as if they had been waiting to be spoken for a long time. "You remind me so much of him, just like your father." Ethan's heart skipped a beat, a strange tightening in his chest. He stared at her, the words echoing in his mind. His father. The woman didn't know him, couldn't possibly know anything about his father. He barely knew anything about his father anymore. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The rain, the city, everything around them seemed to disappear for a moment. He could only focus on the old woman's gaze, deep, knowing, almost as if she had been waiting her whole life for this moment. And then, just as quickly as it had happened, she looked away, her face settling back into the stillness of the world around them. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, his voice suddenly sounding too loud against the quiet of the moment. "I'm sure you're mistaken. I have to go." The woman didn't respond, her eyes still cast downward at the money in her hands. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that something in that brief exchange had opened a door he wasn't ready to walk through. He turned to leave, his shoes splashing against the wet sidewalk, but his thoughts were tangled in a web of confusion. Who was she? And why did her words feel so significant? Ethan tried to push the encounter from his mind, telling himself that she was just another beggar, another face in the crowd. But her words kept lingering, bouncing around inside his head like a persistent echo. The more he thought about it, the more unsettled he became. "You remind me so much of him," his father, Thomas Reed, a man he hadn't thought about in years. The man whose cold gaze and sharp words had defined Ethan's childhood. Thomas Reed had always been a towering figure in his life, distant, unapproachable, and demanding. But now, after all these years, Ethan realized he hadn't really known his father at all. He had only known the version of him that had been shaped by Ethan's own anger and disappointment. Could it be that there was more to the story? More to his father's life than the rigid man he'd grown up with? Ethan shook his head, trying to focus on the present. He had too much on his plate to start wondering about long-forgotten family matters. But still, the encounter with the beggar clung to him. It was a distraction, one he didn't need, especially not now. There was a board meeting in the morning, a potential merger that required his full attention. And yet, even as he climbed into the back of his car, the woman's face lingered. Her words echoed in his mind, unsettling in their simplicity. Just like your father. Ethan tried to push the thought away, but it clung to him, and by the time he got home, the rain had stopped, but the questions remained. What had she meant by that? Why had she said it? Ethan couldn't help but feel that there was more to this woman than met the eye, something deeper at play. But he couldn't quite grasp it. He had given her the money, and that should have been the end of it. She was just another beggar, wasn't she? The thought gnawed at him long after he had settled into bed, tossing and turning as the night stretched on. No matter how much he tried to convince himself that it had been a random encounter, the feeling that something had shifted, something important, refused to leave him. Was it possible she knew something about his father? Or was it simply the ramblings of an old woman trying to make sense of her own life? Ethan didn't know, but one thing was certain. He couldn't let it go. The quiet of Ethan's apartment felt suffocating, like a thick fog that refused to lift. The sound of the rain tapping against the windows had long faded, but the unease from his encounter with the beggar lingered like an unwanted shadow. As he lay in his bed, staring up at the ceiling, his mind refused to settle. It wasn't the rain or the city noise that kept him awake. It was her words, the beggar's words. They had burrowed into his thoughts, wrapping around his mind in a way he couldn't shake. You remind me so much of him, just like your father. Ethan rolled onto his side, pulling the blankets tighter around himself, trying to drown out the persistent echo of those words. He hadn't thought about his father in years. Not really. Thomas Reed had been a distant figure in Ethan's life, a man who had raised him with cold expectations and harsh discipline. Ethan had buried those memories long ago, hiding them in a deep corner of his mind. After all, what was the point of thinking about a father who never seemed to care? A man whose love was as rigid and unyielding as the rules he enforced. But now, thanks to one brief, fleeting encounter with a stranger, his father's shadow loomed over him once again. The memories came flooding back, moments from his childhood that he had long suppressed. His father's stern face, his disapproving glances, the long silences that filled the spaces between them. Ethan had always tried to do what was expected of him, to earn the approval that never came. But it was never enough. As the years passed, Ethan had built a wall around himself, one that kept the pain at bay. He didn't need his father's validation. He didn't need anyone. He had his wealth, his success, and that was all that mattered, or so he had told himself. Now, in the stillness of the night, those long-forgotten emotions began to stir. Ethan found himself questioning everything he had ever believed about his father, and about himself. Had his father truly been as cold and distant as he had always thought? Or had he simply been a man who never knew how to express love? Was there more to Thomas Reed than the stoic, unyielding figure Ethan had always seen him as? Ethan's thoughts turned inward, and he felt a sudden weight in his chest. The grief he had repressed for so long began to creep in, a dull ache that refused to be ignored. It was a grief he had never allowed himself to feel. After all, what was there to grieve? His father had been an obstacle in his life, a figure who had stood between him and his own happiness. He had built his life without him, and in many ways had built a life that felt free from the chains of his father's expectations. But now, lying alone in the darkness, Ethan wondered if he had been fooling himself. Had he really understood who his father was? Had he ever taken the time to understand the man behind the stern exterior? And what kind of legacy had Thomas Reed really left behind? Ethan had spent so many years distancing himself from his father, choosing to focus on his career, his wealth, and his own personal achievements. But now, with the beggar's cryptic words still echoing in his ears, Ethan found himself wondering if he had neglected something far more important, his own history. The thoughts swirled in his mind, each memory tugging at him in different directions. He remembered how his father's voice had always been sharp, how every conversation had felt like a performance. He remembered the moments when his father had stood in the doorway of his room, watching him with a quiet, unreadable expression. Ethan had tried to impress him, tried to be the son he thought Thomas wanted him to be. But now, he wondered if all that effort had been in vain. What had his father truly wanted from him? And more importantly, had he ever really wanted anything from Ethan at all? The weight of those questions pressed down on him, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt the sting of unresolved grief. He hadn't mourned his father's death, not properly. He had brushed it aside, buried it beneath the layers of his success. But now, in the stillness of the night, he couldn't ignore it any longer. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. He hated feeling like this, vulnerable, uncertain, lost. He had spent so many years building a life that seemed perfect on the outside, but now, in the quiet of his thoughts, he realized how hollow it all felt. The wealth, the status, the luxury, it all felt meaningless in the face of this gnawing emptiness. He thought about the beggar again. Her words had been so simple, so innocent, yet they had cut through him like a blade. You remind me so much of him, just like your father. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to her statement, something he was missing. She had been old, frail, barely able to hold her head up. And yet her eyes had held a certain clarity, a knowing that had unsettled him. Had she seen something in him that he couldn't see in himself? Was it possible that she knew something about his father that he didn't? Ethan didn't believe in fate or destiny, but he couldn't deny that the encounter felt too significant to ignore. There was a connection there, a thread between him and the woman that he couldn't quite explain. And then there was the nagging question that he couldn't shake. Why did it matter so much to him? Why did the beggar's words, spoken in the rain, stir up all these feelings he had buried for so long? Ethan had no answers. He only knew that he felt restless, like something was about to shift in his life, something he couldn't control. As the hours ticked by, Ethan found himself trapped in his own thoughts. The weight of the past pressed down on him, a weight he had spent so many years avoiding. He wanted to push it all away, to forget about his father and the bitterness that had tainted their relationship. But no matter how hard he tried, the memories kept coming back, haunting him, challenging him, forcing him to confront the man he had once been, the man he had thought he had left behind. Ethan closed his eyes, trying to will himself to sleep, but the thoughts kept swirling. His father, the beggar, his own repressed grief. It was all too much. He had built an empire, but what did it matter if he couldn't make peace with the past? What was the point of all his success if it didn't fill the emptiness he felt inside? The night stretched on, and with each passing minute, Ethan found himself more lost in his own reflection. The next morning, Ethan found himself standing in front of the large window of his high-rise apartment, staring out at the city below. The hustle and bustle of the streets felt distant, almost like it belonged to someone else. The unsettling restlessness from the night before still lingered in his mind, but now there was an undeniable pull, a need to do something, anything to quiet the chaos within him. Without quite realizing it, he found himself driving toward the cemetery where his father, Thomas Reed, was buried. It had been over 2 decades since he had last visited the site. But today, Something was different. The visit wasn't out of obligation, nor was it for any reason he could easily explain. It was as if a part of him that had been dormant for years had finally awakened, urging him to go, to stand there and face the past he had long since buried. The cemetery was quiet, as cemeteries often are, with only the faintest rustle of wind moving through the trees. Ethan parked his car near the entrance and stepped out. The air felt colder than he expected, but it wasn't unpleasant, just a reminder of the passage of time, perhaps. He made his way to his father's grave slowly, each step heavier than the last. The gravestone loomed before him, weathered by years of neglect. The letters etched into the stone were faint, but Ethan could still make out the name, Thomas Reed. His father's name, engraved in stone, was all that remained of him. There was no warmth to it, no sentiment, just cold stone, and the mark of a man who had been in Ethan's life for so long, yet never truly there. Ethan stood still for a moment, unsure of what to feel. He expected some rush of emotion, some great wave of grief, but nothing came. He didn't feel sadness, nor did he feel relief. Instead, there was an empty void, a hollow space where emotions should have been. It was as if his relationship with his father had been nothing more than a distant memory, a story he had been told, but had never fully lived. He crouched down in front of the gravestone, his fingers brushing against the cold stone. "Here we are, old man," he whispered, his voice barely above a murmur. "I thought I'd never come back." The words hung in the air, carrying a weight that only he could understand. Ethan had spent so many years running from his father's memory, from the man who had never given him the approval he so desperately sought. And now, standing here, Ethan couldn't help but wonder if he had been running from something else all along. As the wind blew softly through the trees, Ethan closed his eyes, letting the quiet of the cemetery wash over him. The world seemed so still here, so untouched by the chaos of his life. It was as though the cemetery was a place where time stood still, where the burdens of the past could be left behind. Just as he was about to stand and leave, he heard a rustle behind him. He turned, expecting to see nothing more than the usual passerby or a fellow visitor, but instead his eyes landed on the same beggar woman he had met the day before. She was sitting near the gravestone, her frail body hunched against the wind, a weathered coat draped around her thin frame. Ethan blinked in disbelief, certain he was imagining things. How could she possibly be here? He took a few cautious steps toward her, his curiosity piqued. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice more surprised than accusatory. The beggar woman looked up slowly, as though she had been expecting him. Her eyes, though tired and worn, held a strange depth, a knowing that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "I could ask you the same thing," she replied softly, her voice carrying an unexpected warmth despite the cold. Ethan frowned, trying to make sense of the situation. I didn't expect to see you here." His words trailed off, and he struggled to find the right ones. The woman's presence felt too coincidental, almost eerie. It was hard to shake the feeling that there was something far deeper going on, something he wasn't seeing. The beggar woman nodded, her expression unreadable. "This is where he rests, isn't it? Thomas Reed." She spoke his father's name without hesitation, as though it was a name she had known her entire life. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "How do you know my father's name?" he asked, his voice tight with surprise. The beggar woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked up at the sky, as if lost in thought. "I knew him, in a way," she said slowly, her words measured. "We had a connection, you could say, a long time ago." She paused as if weighing her next words carefully. He wasn't the man you think he was. Ethan stared at her, trying to piece together what she was saying. His father, the man he had always seen as emotionally distant and stern, was suddenly a mystery. Had she known a side of Thomas that Ethan never did? Had there been more to his father's story than he realized? "Why are you telling me this?" Ethan asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The beggar woman finally met his gaze, her eyes soft but intense. "Because you're just like him, you know. You've been hiding from the same things he hid from your own heart." Ethan's chest tightened, his pulse quickening. The woman's words struck a chord deep within him. He had spent so many years building walls around his heart, so many years running from the pain of his past. And now, here she was, a stranger, a beggar, telling him the truth he had never been able to face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the trees and carrying the sound of distant traffic to their ears. Ethan felt a mixture of confusion and frustration bubbling inside him. He had so many questions, but no answers seemed to be forthcoming. The beggar woman broke the silence, her voice quiet but firm. "Sometimes the answers we seek are hidden in the most unexpected places, and sometimes they're right in front of us." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't sure if he was ready to hear what she had to say, but something told him that he had no choice. There was something more at play here, something far beyond the simple exchange of money or a brief encounter with a stranger. The beggar woman stood slowly, her frail body trembling against the cold. "You'll find what you're looking for, Ethan," she said softly, "but only if you're brave enough to face it." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing alone by his father's grave, his mind spinning with questions that had no easy answers. Ethan stood there, frozen, as the beggar walked away. Her words echoed in his mind, bouncing off the walls of his heart. "You'll find what you're looking for, Ethan, but only if you're brave enough to face it." What did she mean by that? What exactly was he supposed to be seeking? For the first time in years, a deep sense of unease began to settle in his chest, a feeling that had been missing for so long. He stood there, watching her leave, his gaze fixed on her frail form as she disappeared around a corner. It felt as though the conversation had opened a door, one that he had kept shut for far too long. Ethan didn't know what kind of answers he was looking for, but he knew he couldn't just walk away. Not now. Turning back toward his father's grave, Ethan breathed deeply, his breath visible in the cold air. He ran a hand through his hair, the weight of the situation sinking in. The strange encounter with Margaret had stirred something within him, something that had long been buried. The resentment, the confusion, the distance he had kept from his father. None of it made sense anymore. He glanced at his father's name engraved on the stone, Thomas Reed. For the first time in years, he felt a strange pull to understand him, to learn more about the man who had been so pivotal in his life, even if they had never seen eye to eye. There was so much he didn't know about his father, about their relationship, about the years they had wasted. Maybe Margaret knew something. Maybe she held the key to some of the questions that had haunted him for all these years. He quickly walked in the direction Margaret had gone. His steps were hurried now, driven by a curiosity he hadn't felt in ages. His mind raced with possibilities. Who was this woman? Why had she been so open with him about his father? And how had she known so much? Ethan didn't have to search for long. He found her sitting on a bench near the cemetery gates, staring off into the distance. As he approached, she didn't seem surprised to see him again. Her knowing eyes met his with a calm expression, and she patted the empty space beside her, inviting him to sit. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying an air of understanding. Ethan sat down beside her, the question weighing heavily on him. He didn't know what to say. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice raw with confusion. "I'm not even sure what I'm looking for. But you knew my father, Thomas Reed. You said you were a friend of his?" Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes softening. "Yes, Ethan. I knew your father very well. We were close, in our own way." She hesitated for a moment, as if measuring how much to reveal. "But that's a long story, a story that your father, for all his strength, never had the courage to tell you." Ethan listened intently, the question on the tip of his tongue. Why hadn't his father ever told him? But before he could speak, Margaret continued, her voice quieter now, as if recalling memories from another lifetime. "Your father wasn't always the way you remember him. He wasn't just the stern man you saw every day, the one who pushed you so hard, who kept his distance. He had a secret side to him, one that few knew about. A side that was kind, generous, and deeply regretful." Ethan's brow furrowed, the weight of her words sinking in. "Regretful?" he repeated, unsure if he was hearing her correctly. Margaret nodded. "Yes. Regretful. Your father regretted so much in life, Ethan. He regretted the way things turned out between the two of you, the way your relationship was fractured." She sighed softly, a faraway look in her eyes. Thomas was never a man who wore his heart on his sleeve. He was always focused on the bigger picture, on success, on building his legacy. But deep down, he longed for something more, something real, something personal. Ethan's chest tightened at her words. He had always viewed his father as a man driven by duty, by ambition, but never as someone who had longed for connection, for something beyond work and business. He had spent years resenting his father for being emotionally distant, for never showing him affection or understanding. But what if it wasn't entirely his fault? What if Thomas had been struggling with his own regrets? Margaret continued, her voice steady, but filled with an unmistakable sadness. "Thomas often spoke of you, Ethan. He didn't always say it directly, but I could see it in his eyes. He was proud of you, despite everything. He just didn't know how to show it. And that was the hardest part for him." Ethan stared at her, trying to process everything she was saying. He had spent so many years believing that his father had never cared for him, that their relationship had been one-sided. But now, here was a woman, a stranger, telling him that his father had loved him in his own way, that there was so much more to the story than he had ever known. "Why didn't he ever tell me?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking slightly. "Why didn't he just say something? Why did he keep all of this inside?" Margaret's eyes softened, and she placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Thomas wasn't the kind of man who could just open up like that, Ethan. He kept his feelings buried, deep inside. He thought it was weakness to show vulnerability, to admit he needed someone. But he needed you. And he knew, in the end, that the time he had with you was limited. He was afraid that it was too late for him to fix things between the two of you." Ethan sat in silence, the truth of Margaret's words settling over him like a heavy cloak. He had always thought his father was an unsentimental, emotionless man. But now, he could see that there had been so much more beneath the surface. A man who had struggled with the very same things Ethan had struggled with: pride, fear, regret. After a long pause, Ethan finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never knew any of this. I never knew he felt this way." Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes filled with empathy. Most people never did. But you're his son. You were the one person he wanted to connect with. The one person he hoped would understand him, even if he couldn't say it out loud. Ethan's heart ached as he absorbed the weight of her words. His father's regrets, his unspoken love, the years of distance between them. It all seemed so tragic now, so unnecessary. If only he had known, if only they had found a way to bridge the gap, to talk, to understand one another. Margaret gave him a small, sad smile. There's a lot more to this story, Ethan. But maybe now you're ready to hear it. Maybe now you can understand what your father never had the courage to say. Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine as Margaret led him through a narrow corridor into an old, secluded room. The room was dimly lit, filled with the scent of aged paper and wood. It felt like stepping into a forgotten piece of history, a place untouched by time. As Margaret pulled open a weathered wooden chest, Ethan could see that it was filled with boxes, each one labelled with names and dates. "These are your father's things," Margaret said softly, her voice tinged with respect. "He kept them here, hidden away, for a reason. When he asked me to keep these, he said there would come a time when you would need them. He believed in you, Ethan. He believed you could handle the truth." Margaret began pulling out the contents, carefully placing them on a nearby table. Letters tied with twine, old photographs, and a few personal items, worn books, a pocket watch, and a few small trinkets, were all laid before him. The objects looked so ordinary, yet Ethan could feel their significance pressing on him. Each one was a piece of his father's story, a story he had never known. As he picked up one of the letters, Ethan could see that his father's handwriting was neat and precise. Yet, there was a shakiness to it, as though Thomas had struggled with the words he wrote. Ethan's hands trembled as he untied the string and unfolded the letter. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but it wasn't this. The words on the paper were heartfelt, raw, and filled with guilt. Thomas had written this letter to Ethan long before he passed, but it was clear that he had been grappling with the weight of their relationship for a long time. As Ethan read, the letters painted a picture of a man who had been far more than the distant, stoic figure Ethan remembered. The letters revealed his father's silent battles, his personal regrets, his guilt, and his longing for connection with the son he had failed to reach. Ethan's eyes scanned the paper, his heart heavy with each word. "I regret not telling you how proud I am of you," one of the letters read. "I've always been proud of you, but I've never said it. You deserved better from me. I can only hope that one day you'll forgive me for not being the father you needed. I failed you, Ethan, and I'm sorry." The weight of his father's apology pressed down on Ethan's chest. This was not the man he had known, the man who had kept everything bottled up, who had never shown affection. This was a man who had carried his guilt with him every single day. As Ethan moved through the letters, he could feel the emotional toll they had taken on Thomas, a man who had worked tirelessly to build an empire, but who had failed to build a relationship with the one person who mattered most to him. Margaret remained quiet as Ethan read, her gaze soft but unwavering. She could see the turmoil in Ethan's eyes, the pain of discovering this hidden side of his father. She knew this wasn't easy for him, learning that the man who had seemed so perfect, so distant, was also flawed, regretful, and human. But she also knew that this was a step Ethan had to take. The truth had to come out, no matter how painful it was. Finally, Ethan reached the last letter, the one that seemed to carry the most weight. It was more recent, written in Thomas's final days. Margaret had said these letters were meant for Ethan when the time was right, and now, it seemed, that time had come. His hand shook as he unfolded the paper, and his breath caught in his throat as he began to read. The words were simple but profound. Ethan, my son, I know I won't be here much longer. I've lived my life with many regrets, but the one that haunts me the most is the way I treated you. I was always so focused on success, on making something of myself, that I forgot to make something of us. I hope that when I'm gone, you'll understand why I was the way I was. And more than anything, I hope you'll forgive me. I know I can't change the past, but I want you to know that I always loved you, even when I couldn't show it. I failed you, but I hope you'll find a way to forgive me. My last wish is that we can find peace, you and I. Ethan's breath hitched as the final words sank in. The man he had thought he knew, his distant father, had wanted nothing more than for Ethan to understand him. He had hoped for forgiveness, for the chance to heal the rift between them, but it had never happened. Now, reading these words, Ethan realized just how much his father had carried with him. All this time, his father had hoped that Ethan would be able to forgive him, but that was something Ethan had never been able to do, until now. Margaret stood quietly beside him, giving him space to absorb everything. The silence in the room was heavy, and for the first time, Ethan allowed himself to feel the full weight of his father's absence. The anger, the resentment, everything that had built up over the years began to soften. He had been holding on to these feelings for so long, thinking they defined who he was, but now, in the face of these letters, he saw a different side to his father, a side that had been buried under years of pride, success, and unspoken sorrow. Margaret spoke softly, almost as if she were reading his thoughts. Thomas left these letters for you, Ethan, because he believed in you. He knew that, deep down, you would find the strength to understand him. He wanted you to know that he was sorry, and that he never stopped loving you. He never wanted to be the man who pushed you away. Ethan wiped his eyes, his emotions a swirling mix of grief, guilt, and something he hadn't felt in years: hope. For the first time, he felt like he understood his father, like the man who had been a mystery for so long was finally being revealed to him. It was painful, and it was raw, but it was also freeing. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that the past was finally being put to rest. Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder, offering him a quiet comfort. You don't have to carry this weight anymore, Ethan. It's time to let go. Ethan sat in the quiet room, the letters scattered before him like pieces of a puzzle he was struggling to put together. The weight of his father's words pressed down on him, a burden that seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. The man he had known, his father, Thomas Reed, had always been distant, unapproachable, a figure of authority and pride. To learn that this man had been carrying so much guilt, regret, and sorrow for years was almost more than Ethan could bear. As he stared at the letters, Ethan's mind raced. The father he had built up in his mind was not the man these letters spoke of. He had always seen Thomas as a cold, unreachable figure. To Ethan, his father had never been a source of comfort or support. There had always been a chasm between them, a gap that Thomas had never tried to bridge. Now, reading these words, Ethan realized that it wasn't that his father hadn't cared. It was that he hadn't known how to show it. The anger inside Ethan flared, but it was quickly followed by a deep sadness. He had spent so many years resenting his father for the emotional distance between them. He had blamed Thomas for the coldness that had defined their relationship, never once considering that his father might have wanted things to be different. But now, with the letters in front of him, Ethan saw a different story. His father had regretted every moment of their separation, Thomas had tried, in his own way, to reach out. He had wanted to fix their relationship, but Ethan had never given him the chance. "Why didn't he tell me this while he was alive?" Ethan whispered aloud, his voice filled with disbelief. "Why wait until it's too late?" The anger surged again, more intense now, bubbling up from the depths of his chest. Ethan stood up abruptly, pushing the chair back. He paced around the room, trying to make sense of everything. The man he had known, the father who had seemed like an immovable pillar, had been full of regret and remorse. And yet, he had never shared this side of himself with Ethan. It felt like a betrayal. Ethan had spent so many years carrying the weight of their broken relationship, thinking that it was entirely his father's fault. He had blamed Thomas for their emotional distance, for the way he had always been distant and unemotional. But now, with the letters as proof, Ethan understood that his father had been carrying his own burdens, ones that had kept him from reaching out to his son. The anger mixed with guilt, and Ethan couldn't tell which emotion was stronger. He had held on to his resentment for so long, convinced that he was justified in his bitterness. Now, he wondered if that bitterness had clouded his judgment. Had he been too quick to condemn his father? Had he closed the door on a relationship that could have been repaired, if only he had seen the signs earlier? The sadness crept in, filling the hollow space left by the anger. Ethan had always longed for his father's approval, for some sign that Thomas cared. But now, with these letters, he realized that his father had always cared. He had just never known how to show it. It was a harsh truth to face, but it was one that Ethan had to confront. Ethan sank back into the chair, his mind whirling. He was torn between so many conflicting emotions. He wanted to be angry at his father, but he also wanted to forgive him. He had spent so many years hating Thomas for the way their relationship had turned out, but now he wasn't sure who was to blame. Was it his father, who had kept his feelings locked away? Or was it Ethan himself, who had never given his father the chance to explain or to make things right? The letters painted a picture of a man who had been overwhelmed by his own pride and guilt. Thomas had been too proud to admit his mistakes and too ashamed to seek forgiveness before it was too late. But even as Ethan read the letters, he couldn't help but wonder, could he forgive him now? Could he let go of all the years of anger and resentment, or would he forever be haunted by the weight of their fractured relationship? The burden of his father's mistakes wasn't just on Thomas anymore. It was now on Ethan's shoulders. He had to decide what to do with the knowledge he had gained. Could he let go of the past? Could he move forward, knowing that his father had tried in his own way to make amends? Or would he continue to carry the anger that had defined his relationship with Thomas for so long? Ethan stood up again, walking to the window. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast, as though it, too, was mourning the loss of a father and son who had never truly understood one another. Ethan's reflection in the window seemed distant, just as distant as the relationship he had shared with Thomas. He wondered if things could have been different if they had just talked, if they had communicated better. But the past was gone. The damage had been done, and there was no going back. All Ethan had now were these letters, these words of regret, and a lifetime of missed opportunities. The question was, what would he do with them? As he looked out at the darkened sky, Ethan realized that forgiveness wasn't something that could be given easily. It wasn't a decision that could be made overnight. He would need time to process everything, to find a way to let go of the anger and resentment that had been building up inside him for so many years. But one thing was clear. He couldn't continue to live in the shadow of his father's mistakes. He couldn't carry that weight any longer. With a deep breath, Ethan wiped away the tear that had escaped from his eye. He wasn't sure how to begin, But he knew that this was the first step, facing the truth, even if it was painful. He had spent so many years thinking he was the one who had been wronged, but now he saw that the truth was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. And maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to heal. The days that followed Ethan's discovery of his father's letters were a blur. He had gone through the motions of his everyday life, meetings, calls, decisions, yet none of it seemed to matter anymore. His mind was consumed by one single thought: forgiveness. The words his father had left behind weighed heavily on him. They stirred something deep inside him, a feeling he couldn't escape. Each time he tried to move forward, the memory of his father's regrets would pull him back, anchoring him in the past. Ethan had always prided himself on his ability to control his emotions, to suppress anything that might distract him from his goals. But this was different. This was raw, personal, and it felt like a wound that had been reopened, one that had been buried for so long. The anger he had carried for years now seemed trivial compared to the complexity of his feelings. It wasn't just anger he felt anymore. There was sadness, confusion, and a deep, aching emptiness that he couldn't fill. He had spent so many years resenting his father, believing that Thomas was the sole cause of their broken relationship. But now, Ethan couldn't help but question his own actions. Had he been too quick to judge? Had he pushed his father away just as much as his father had pushed him? The realization was painful, and with it came an overwhelming sense of guilt. Margaret had become a strange but necessary part of his journey. In the quiet moments they spent together, she had listened to his frustrations, his doubts, and his confusion. She had seen the man Ethan was becoming, someone who was slowly but surely starting to understand the depths of his father's struggles. She had offered wisdom, not just as someone who had known Thomas, but as someone who had experienced her own share of heartache. Margaret wasn't just a guide. She was a reminder that forgiveness wasn't just about the person who had wronged you. It was about freeing yourself from the chains of the past. "Ethan," Margaret said softly one afternoon as they sat in her small, humble living room. "Forgiveness isn't about erasing the pain. It's about letting go of the power that pain holds over you. You're holding on to a history that's no longer serving you. To heal, you have to release it." Her words stuck with him, echoing in his mind. He wasn't just angry with his father. He was angry with the past, with the way things had unfolded. He had never had the chance to make amends, to bridge the gap that had separated him from Thomas. Now, the reality of that loss was almost too much to bear. But Margaret was right. If he didn't forgive, if he didn't find a way to make peace with the past, it would consume him. It had already consumed so much of his life, the regret, the missed opportunities, the silence. He realized that the anger he had clung to for so long wasn't just hurting his father's memory, it was hurting him. It was keeping him trapped in a loop of resentment and sorrow. Ethan had always been a man of action, someone who believed that everything could be fixed if you just worked hard enough. But this was different. He couldn't fix the past. He couldn't go back and change what had happened. All he could do was face the truth and choose to move forward, with or without his father's forgiveness. The first step toward healing came unexpectedly one evening. After weeks of internal struggle, Ethan found himself standing in front of his father's grave once again. He hadn't planned to visit that day. He had told himself he would take a break from it, that he needed time to think, to process everything he had learned. But something had drawn him back. Perhaps it was the weight of the unresolved emotions, or maybe it was the fact that he had started to realize just how much he needed to reconcile with the man he had once called his father. The cemetery was quiet, as it always was, with only the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Ethan stood there for a long moment, his hands stuffed in his coat pockets. The gravestone in front of him was weathered, the words nearly faded with time. He had avoided it for so long, but now, for the first time, he truly saw it. His father's name, the years of his birth and death, and a simple line that had always seemed so inadequate. Beloved father. Ethan's heart ached as he stared at it. It wasn't the simple words that brought the pain, though. It was the realization that he had never really taken the time to understand his father, to see him as more than just a distant figure. He had let bitterness cloud his judgment, and now, standing here, in the presence of the man who had given him life, Ethan knew it was time to let go. With a deep breath, he began to speak. The words felt awkward at first, like a stranger trying to express emotions they had never dared to voice before. But as he spoke, they began to flow. He told his father about his life,